For your final assignment in this course, I'm going to have you rig this piranha plant to perform various animations in conjunction with a character controller in Unity. So I'm going to show what you have to start with real quick. This came from, by the way, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. There's a site that provides the rigged models from various games, and so I grabbed it. It was actually in a state that was not going to be conducive to our efforts, and so I've re-rigged it just by unbinding all the skins, deleting some bones and reorienting them so that they faced upward in Maya, and then just making sure that everything reattached again. There are quite a number of bones, though, and so for that purpose, I'm going to teach you how to make a Spline Ik, which will essentially reach through these long chains and just create one simple interface to deal with them. But just so that you know there's more than one way to handle this kind of problem, you could have a single controller which orient constrains all of the subsequent joints, in which case you would get this kind of functionality. All I've done right now is select all the joints and I'm rotating them together, and this is the sort of thing you can achieve if you just control all of the bones simultaneously. And it's not bad. It's good for simplistic purposes and it's nice and quick to set up and use, but having a Spline Ik can be a little bit more powerful, and so I'll demonstrate that in a moment. So let's just look through really quickly. They had a translate bone down on the bottom. This is not uncommon. This is a good way to keep track of where the game object is even when the animations are doing something different. They had a rotation bone, which I don't really know the purpose of breaking these two apart, but that's fine. Here's hip. So this would be what we've been treating as our root. So that would be your first animation bone. You can just ignore the other two if you'd like. We've got what they're calling waist, bust, neck, but you can see the anatomy of this character doesn't really coincide with that. So these are just the sort of plant body, and then neck is the first one that is a part of the actual stem of this piranha plant, as you can see. We've got two different chains of bones in the leaves, which control all of those. By the way, this will be fully skinned when you receive it, so you don't have to do any of the skinning or paint weighting. It's not great, but it will serve. I did see that there were these tiny little bones that were spurred out on either side and controlled what seemed to be one part of each of these leaves. I recommend that you just ignore those for our purposes, because it will keep this a lot simpler. But I think it was so that you could fold and unfold the plant leaves, and so that you could pinch the spurs together, these little spikes coming out on the side. You can just freely ignore that. So both sides have that capability. There's no real shoulder shrug, although there is, you know, a separation here. If you moved this, you could move the position of the leaf, but there's no rotation there. We do have two little feet coming out of the bottom. I think they're pretty cute. They've got a controller right in between the two of them to control the pelvis if you wanted to. And then each of those can just rotate and bend at the knee, just as you would expect. And it's got one ankle control. If you want to set up an Ik for those, you can. And if you don't want to and you want to ignore them, then you could just set the pot down on the ground and pretend it doesn't have any feet. Up on the head, we've got the more complicated setup. Oops, I didn't set this back to render. There we go. Here's the entire head. And there are separate geometries on here. Not that you would have to deal with them, but if I select this side here, so this is one jaw, and if I select this one, this is another jaw. They're all sort of labeled here in the outliner. So this jaw has a bunch of bones attached to it. Some of them are just teeth. So like that one is just a tooth control, as well as this one here and this one over here. So you may or may not ever even animate those, but the stems going down the center allow for flexible bending of the upper and lower jaw. So we've got one last little lip adjustment here, and that one there, and then this one that opens and closes the entire thing. And the other side has the same thing. So this one controls the entire opening and closing minus the tongue. Then we've got this one for upper flexibility. It deforms all right. I didn't do a super great job with the paint weighting, but it's serviceable, and you don't have to repair it. And then this last little bit here, and then all of the teeth. And the tongue has a overall rotation and positioner. You can position this bone as well if you like to move it. And one flexible bone in the middle, and then a final flexible bit on the tip. So if you want the tongue to do animations, then you can do that as well. Okay. And that's about it for the character. So we've got the ability to move the entire body around the pot. The pot has its own bones. It actually didn't in the original, but I thought that it should. So now we've got this bone, which can move the pot independent of the rest of it, and these two bones, which can bend the pot a little bit or squash and stretch the pot if you wanted to. I wouldn't recommend doing a lot of that, but if you wanted to, and you could also set up an IK for that. There we go. So that's about it for this character. The character controller in Unity I'm going to show off in another section here, and it's going to be able to respond to the player controller, which is a first-person controller, how close it gets to this character, how directly it's looking at this character, and whether or not it's been clicked on. So the kind of animation cycles that you choose to use for that will be up to you. But the first task that you have to do is apply controls to the skeleton so that it is more convenient to animate. Then you'll export those animation clips into Unity and set up the animation controller and test it, and you will be done. Okay, so that's what our final assignment is going to be. I'm going to show you now how to set up a Spline Ik control so that you could potentially use the leaves and the neck for that. Here I have 3 different styles of Spline Ik. These are already completely set up, and I'm just going to show you what your options are once you have this completely set up. The stretch one, by the way, is much harder, and I'm not going to demonstrate how to do it in these videos, but just know that you can definitely look up how to do this. It's not that complicated. If you want to know, ask me. In one of our live sessions, I will demonstrate it. It takes a little bit of time, but the principle is pretty simple. So this is the root style Spline Ik. As you can see, all 3 of them, if I move or rotate this lower ring, all the controllers and the mesh moves along with it. That should be universal. Then the difference here is that the root only moves each part of the spline, and none of the others have anything to do with the next part of the spline. So this is best for standing formations like a wiggling tube or a worm or something blowing in the wind or something like that. None of these have any control over the next parts. You can see if I move this far enough that it sort of get tugged away because the line is here invisible and we can't see. Let's see, there it goes. The line is here and it will only attach itself to the line if it's still within range, and I'm moving it out of range, and so now it can no longer reach. Okay, so that's one of the most simplistic setups for Spline Ik. This is the one that you get first before you do any parenting of your controllers. This one, chain, would be the next step. I prefer this one, honestly, because when you move the first bit, the rest of them respond and move. So if I rotate it, it acts sort of like a forward kinematic control. And then this one moves the next ones down the chain, and this one moves the next ones down the chain, and so on and so on. You can still move the lower controls away, and it gets out of range a little bit. But if you move the upper controls, the entire thing moves and responds with it. I sort of prefer this because if I'm going to use a Spline Ik, I kind of just want to keep it sort of in a smooth forward kinematic kind of setup like this. I just find that it tends to be what I prefer, but you may not. This one is one of the more complicated setups. It requires a lot more steps, but here's the benefit. If I move, if I can grab this thing, there it goes. If I move one piece of it, it stretches and stretches and stretches and tries to maintain the position on all the other controllers while getting longer and longer and longer. It doesn't do a perfect job, but almost. So here, you can see I can make it quite long. Let's grab this one, stretch it out there. And you can kind of see under the hood all of the bones moving, but there's a bunch of locators, and that's kind of the key to this one. So if you want squash and stretchy lines, then this is a really nice setup. You do have to be careful about getting ugly pinches like this because this line doesn't have lots of CVs. Maybe I should have added more and figured out something with these clusters to share it a little bit more smoothly, but there you have it. There's the squash and stretchy Spline Ik. So probably you're going to set up either this root or chain. The only difference between these two is whether or not you parent the subsequent controllers to each other. If you do that, then you get the chain. If you don't do that, you get the root. This is the first style of Spline Ik. Okay, so now I'm going to demonstrate how to set up the Spline Ik. We'll do our demonstration directly on the piranha plant, on the neck from the head, because that's likely the most common place that you would want to use it on this assignment. I'm going to go to the rigging module, skeleton. And here we have create IK handle. Just below that, we have create spline IK handle. That's what we want. Taking a look at the option box, this is our menu. I'm going to go ahead and reset this just so it's exactly the way that you would encounter it. We've got a few options here. Root on curve, we're going to want to turn off. That would be if you are having the parent bone for the skeletal structure inside of this curve structure. We don't, so we're going to turn that off. Auto parent curve. That's another one that I'm going to recommend that you turn off. What this would do is make the curve that results from this a child of the first bone. That can be sometimes something you want. In our case, it's not because of the way that we're going to use our controls. So we're going to turn that off as well. Auto create curve, sure. Auto simplify curve, sure. And then the number of spans. This is sort of up to you. How many control structures do you want in the middle of this curve? If you just want one, then what you're going to be capable of is basically a C bend. No matter what you do, you have a tiny, tiny bit of S at the beginning and end, but really that's all you're going to get. 2 will give you the ability to go off to one side and to the other to get a zigzag or an S kind of structure. And a 3 will give you 1, 2, 3 in the middle, plus the start and the end. By the way, for every spline that we create, there will be 2 control vertices at the top and the bottom, no matter what you pick here. So 1 will give 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 2 will give 2 in the middle, plus the 2 at the top and the bottom. So I often pick 3 or 2, depending on what we want here. I'll go ahead and pick 3 just so that I have a bunch of them to demonstrate on, and then we're pretty much good to go. So we've got our tool, right? Tool settings, our tool here, crosshair, and we're going to click just like we would for an IK handle on the starting bone and at the ending bone. So I'm going to go from here to, it's kind of up to you if you want to click on the head or the last neck bone. I'm going to click on the head right up there. There we go. So that worked. Our IK handle is selected. Here's our curve and our IK, but you can't move your IK handle, and that's normal. For a spline IK, you're not intended to be able to move the IK handle. It is the curve that we have to control. So it's a little tough to see everything right now. So I'm going to turn off the mesh and the bones so that we can just see that there's this curve floating inside. And here's the IK handle that we can't move. This IK handle is locked. I often just turn off the visibility for this IK handle because it's not really going to function at all in the view. So I just turn it off. We'll have a do not touch folder in a minute. And then this curve is what we need to use to control the bones. We have to do right click and hold, control vertex, and then these are what we are going to use to control the shape of the curve. Okay. So the reason that we do that is because we're deforming. This is technically a deformer. Okay. And as this deforms, if I turn the bones back on, you can see the bones are traveling along with that line, including all of the children bones. Okay. So we want to reset this to its default state. And the very first task is to create clusters. Clusters are persistent handles that will control these CVs. This CV is only accessible in a component mode, and we need it to be something that is persistent and has a presence in our scene. So I'm going to encircle the first 2 control vertices together, come up to deform, and create cluster right here. Okay, it's that little letter C, and it has a presence in our outliner. Okay, leave it still, select the line again, go back to component mode, grab the next 1 cluster handle. Let's make sure I'm getting that correct. So we've got 1. It's very hard to see. I cannot see how many cluster handles I have. Oh, there we go. Okay, I was just too far zoomed in. So these 2 were our first selection. This is our next one. And we're going to create cluster. Then grab the line, go back to component mode, grab the next 1, create cluster, or deform, create cluster. And then finally, control vertex, these 2, deform, create cluster. So there you can see I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 handles, and always grouping the top 2 and the bottom 2. All right. So now this curve, I don't really want to be able to select it. I need to be able to select the clusters instead. So I'm going to go ahead and just make another layer for that curve and set it to template. Oops, I accidentally put that cluster on there. Let me go ahead and undo that. You can remove from a layer by right-clicking, remove selected objects. So there we go. So now I've got that templated. So I can just grab the clusters. Let's turn on our bones and our mesh and set those to render template respectively. So you can see the mesh moves and bends based on those cluster handles. Okay. This first one you often don't want to move. You may want to rotate it, but that one is the root of this curve, so very likely that you're not going to want to move that around. The tip, remember, we haven't made a squash and stretchy handle. If you move it, it's going to go out of range. So keep in mind that there's this curve, this invisible curve in here that you have to kind of try to line up with wherever the head ends up in order to get the full range of the curve. Okay, so there's our three. And the good thing about cluster handles is if I grab them and zero their rotations and translates, they go right back to their default positions. So for the purposes of rigging, whatever other structure you're going to make, we're going to attach these clusters to NURBS controllers. So here I've got a small curve, and I'm going to snap it using V for vertex, either to the bones or to the cluster handle. I guess if I want it to be on the cluster handle, I can turn all of this off, hold down V, and I can snap to that cluster handle right there. And then duplicate this, snap it to the next one, and the next one. So make sure they're big enough to see, they are. And then name them, of course. So we're going to name this neck control 1, like that. And if we wanted to name all three of them, if you recall, we can grab them like this, and up here, name them neck control, and they will number them for us, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Although not necessarily in the right order. Didn't do it in the right order. Let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, and try that one more time. Neck control. Uh-oh. I'm not sure if it did it in the right order. I think it's still, oh, it did do it in the right order that time. I had to change the way I typed it out or else it wouldn't even try. Okay. Then each of these clusters, you should parent constrain them, because even though the clusters don't always have rotation, these ones in the middle have no rotation. The ones that have 2 have rotation because there are 2 points on it. So just parent constrain them all. So from controller to cluster, constrain parent, controller to cluster, constrain parent, and so on. Constrain parent. Okay. So we're all done with having the clusters visible. So at this point, we should probably create a do not touch folder that will contain the IK handle, the curve, the cluster handles. So I'll go ahead and edit, group, call this DNT, and then go ahead and just turn off the visibility for that, just like that. I'm going to show the mesh and the bones so that we can see how this controls. Remember, I haven't parented my controls together at all, so this first one just kind of controls the root. The second one, the lower third, the upper third, and then finally the head itself, which it doesn't control the orientation of the head, which is why you may want to only have this go to the second to last bone, to this one. That way you could have a controller on top of this, which controls the head, or if you orient constrain this to that bone, then you've got the neck stem and the head orientation at the same time. Okay. The difference between the two styles of spline control is just in whether you parent these curves. So if you want it like this, then you're all done. If you would like them to move as a chain, like a forward kinematic chain, then we can grab the last one, the second to last one, and hit P for parent. Then this one, P for parent, this one, and the final one, P for parent. Now, when I rotate one, they rotate all of their children. Okay, you can still move them, but keep in mind that they will move all of their children. Okay, set that back up, back. I'm going to make the bones interactable just for a moment, and then we'll just do, for the sake of argument, an orient constrain from this one to this bone. So constrain, orient, make sure it's all 3 channels, apply. Okay, and then we'll make the bones non-interactable again. So now when I rotate this, it will aim the head and the neck in a limited way. So I've got fairly easy control over the orientation of the stem. There we go. So that's how you set up a Spline Ik with either style. So you're probably going to want to do this to the leaves, probably going to want to do this to the neck. You have to do it for your homework on one of those, but you don't have to do it on the others. Okay, so set up a Spline Ik probably on the neck. If you want to do it on the leaves, go ahead. If you want to set up a set-driven key that just rotates all of these at the same time, feel free to do that. I'm not going to demonstrate that because we've already demonstrated things of that nature in this course already. The idea is that you are on your own and you need to figure out how to rig this creature so that you can animate it and implement it into Unity. Keep in mind that custom channels exist whenever you have a curve selected. You can do edit, add attribute, and to do set-driven keys, I always come over to the animation menu, key, set-driven key, option box. So whatever you've got driving it up here and the driven down here, and you set your keys. That's how that works. Okay. And you've got all of your constraints available. Parent for both position and rotation, point for just position, orient for just rotation, scale if you want it. I think they did animate scale on this originally. Aim for things like eyeballs. So you could have an aim constraint for like maybe the head and a floating point somewhere out here where it aims at. Pole vectors for IK, etc., etc. Okay. So that's what you're going to be doing. This will take 2 weeks. We've got 2 weeks until the end of the course. In the first week, I would recommend that you set up the controls and do all of your animations, but I'm going to make the entire thing available to you so you can break up your time however you see fit. All right, finally, I'm going to show you the scene that you are going to be using here in the assets folder just to kind of show a tour through. I've got this animation controller here, but I'm going to delete this. You're going to have to make this on your own. But what it contains are these parameters. These 3 parameters are essential. You have to have them exactly as shown. Player distance with a capital D, camera angle with a capital A, and clicked on with a capital O, no spaces at all. This is a float, and a trigger. Okay, so all those types are right here, a float, and a trigger. And what they measure are how far away you are from the pot, how closely you are looking towards the pot, and I'll demonstrate that in a moment, and whether or not you've clicked on the pot. This slot prefab is the entire assemblage right there. It contains a planter, which you can turn off if you want to use the piranha plants or not, I guess. You could just turn off the piranha plants plot in your rig and have him coming out of here if you'd like. But I needed something visual in the scene, so there it is. I've got this drag onto this portion, which has the behavior script and the capsule collider. So do not replace this. Do not destroy this. You need this in order for it to function. The replace me part is what you need to have your rig being. So you're going to need an animator component on your rig, and you're also going to need to have your animator controller hooked up there. And then this will be replaced. For now, that's the dummy just so that I can demonstrate somehow. If I hit play and then leave the animator showing, I'm going to click on the replace me portion so that you can see everything updating. Here we've got the first person character controller looking around in the scene. You can see the player distance variable will get smaller as we get closer to the pot and bigger as we go farther away. You could use that with a blend tree, or you could use it as a threshold when we get underneath 5 units, for instance. Some animation starts playing or is triggered. or beyond 5 units or something like that. The minimum is not 0. We can't really get any closer than about 1.4 or so. So just know that you're at point blank range at about 1 point something, or 2 would be about point blank range. Camera angle measures if you're looking directly at this spot right here at the top of the soil. So somewhere in the region here gets closer and closer to -1. The closer we are to -1, the more directly we're looking at the plant. Peripheral vision is somewhere around -0.5, 0.6. If we're further away, it doesn't really change. -0.1, 0.5, or sorry, -0.5, 0.6, something like that. At 0, we're looking perpendicular to the plant, and at 1, we're looking directly away from it. So there wouldn't be a lot of point in playing animations from 1 to 0 because we're looking in the wrong direction. Okay? As you can see, we cannot fall. There's no gravity enabled on this character, so feel free to walk wherever you want. Finally, clicked on measures if we have clicked somewhere within the capsule collider area. And you can see when I do that, it's triggering that transition down there. So you can click on the pot, or you can click in the midair just above the pot right here. Also counts, but your piranha plant has a big head, so unless you change the size of the collider, I won't be able to click up here. Okay, so those 3 attributes are what you have to play with, and I just want to be able to interact with this character somehow. So you decide how you mix and match those things. You decide whether or not you have override layers and character masks. Remember that we can create new layers and mask off certain parts of it to create additional effects. And you can blend the animation happening on one layer with that happening on lower layers. Okay, and all of this is yours to play with. So you're going to have to create your own character controller, set up your own parameters, make sure it all hooks up correctly and test it. And then the very last thing that you would do is to break this apart. So we would go to, where is it here? Unpack. Where's unpack? I'm just not seeing it. Paste as child, select as shown. Oh, sorry, it's in this prefab menu. Prefab, unpack. So now it's not a prefab. And just go ahead and rename this with your last name. All the way up here at slot is fine. Last name, homework. And I think we're at 15. Hopefully you'll get that correct. And then drag that into the prefabs folder. So last name, homework 5, as soon as you've got it all set up, drag it in there. Make sure that you file away all of your various components into the correct place. And then you will right-click, export package, and make sure all of the dependencies are included, and then export. And that will be what you turn in for your homework. All right? So hopefully you get to have a little bit of fun with this. It's a little bit more free-form, and I just want you to play with the animation loops that you can create and their definitions, play with the character animation controller, and see what you can do with those variables. I'm not going to put any hard requirement on how many things need to happen, only that for this entire homework assignment, you, 1, use a Spline Ik at least 1 time in the rigging of the character, and 2, have your character responding to these variables in some way. So you don't have to use all 3 of them, but you should use at least 2 of them. Let's say distance and camera angle and clicked and distance, whatever. Use at least 2 of them. If you want to use all 3, then that's great. If you want to layer them up, then that's great too. Okay, but the rest is up to you. All right. Good luck. Happy animating. Ask questions in chat if you need to, and I look forward to seeing this. One last quick bit of information when you first open up this scene. So here's an empty Unity scene. I'm going to drag in the package, and here are all the things that come with the package. Go ahead and import. You are going to have all of this in your assets folder. Go into scenes, open the test scene. Here we are. And if you attempt to play this, it will give you errors. And that is normal because there are a couple of things that you need to do. One, on replace me, we're missing the character controller, which you're going to have to create. And that would be after you drag your animated character into this spot and put the animator component on it. And also drag onto this has a slot for player. that doesn't preserve between making a package and my original file. So you just have to drag this player first person onto that slot to assign it so that it knows what it's measuring from. So now if I hit play and test this, it's still not going to work really because there's no animator to report to, right? It's giving me errors down there, but it should function, and at least you can see the distance and look angle is being reported in that script. So that's all you need to do to set it up, and happy animating.